In June 1869, John Roebling stood at the edge of New York's East River, imagining the world's longest suspension bridge. Just days later, a simple step crushed his foot, an accident that would infect him with tetanus and end his life before construction even began. The Brooklyn Bridge would claim its architect before a single stone was laid. How did a dream of engineering genius turn into a race against mortality, thrusting Roebling's untested son into a challenge that would demand everything? This story begins where visionary ambition collides with sudden tragedy. John Augustus Roebling arrived in New York with a plan that defied the limits of 19th-century engineering. Born in Prussia and trained as an engineer, Roebling had already built his reputation on projects like the Cincinnati-Covington Bridge, once the world's longest suspension span. But the Brooklyn Bridge would surpass anything seen before. His proposal called for a main span stretching 1,595 feet across the East River, a distance many believed impossible to cross with a single sweep of cable and steel. Roebling's design relied on his own invention, twisted steel wire rope, capable of carrying loads far beyond what iron chains could bear. Each of the four main cables would be 15 3/4 inches thick, spun from thousands of wires, anchored in stone towers that would rise 278 feet above the river. The towers themselves, built from granite and limestone, would stand taller than any structure in Brooklyn or Manhattan. Roebling insisted on a safety margin that dwarfed the standards of his day, calculating the bridge could withstand the weight of the heaviest traffic for generations. The bridge was meant to do more than connect two cities. It would unite two worlds, transforming the daily lives of tens of thousands who relied on slow, crowded ferries to cross the water. The New York Bridge Company backed Roebling's vision, granting him the title of chief engineer in 1867. Maps, sketches, and prospectuses circulated through city halls and newspapers, promising a future where commerce and community flowed freely between boroughs. For Roebling, the bridge was not just an engineering challenge, but a monument to human ambition, built to endure long after its builders were gone. On a humid afternoon in late June 1869, John Roebling stood at the edge of the East River, marking the precise spot for the Brooklyn Tower. A ferry drifting in at Fulton Slip pressed his right foot against a wooden piling. The force shattered bone and flesh in an instant. Witnesses rushed him away from the water, carrying him to his son Washington's home on Hicks Street. There, surgeons removed several mangled toes without anesthetic, following the best practice they knew. Infection was an ever-present threat, but Roebling dismissed the doctor's warnings. He insisted on treating the wound himself, pouring cold well water over the injury, trusting in hydrotherapy and his own stubborn resolve. Within days, his condition worsened. Muscles stiffened, his jaw locked, and spasms racked his body. The symptoms were unmistakable: tetanus, a disease that medicine in 1869 could not cure. Newspapers like the Brooklyn Daily Eagle reported on the chief engineer's decline, describing the accident and his refusal to accept further medical intervention. Family letters from the period reveal a man aware of his fate. Roebling reportedly told those around him, "I have the plague." On July 22nd, just 24 days after the accident, John Roebling died in his Brooklyn Heights home. The bridge that carried his name had not yet broken ground. His death left the greatest engineering project in America without its architect, and the city's boldest promise suddenly seemed fragile. The foundation for the Brooklyn Bridge had claimed its first life before the first stone was ever set. Only days after John Roebling's death, the trustees of the New York Bridge Company faced a decision that would determine the project's future. The plans were intact, but the mind that shaped them was gone. Into this vacuum stepped Washington Augustus Roebling, John's eldest son, already steeped in the technical demands of the bridge and no stranger to adversity. Washington had studied engineering at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, then tested his skills as a Union officer building pontoon bridges under fire during the Civil War. He had worked beside his father on earlier suspension projects and spent months on the Brooklyn Bridge surveys, learning every detail of the design. In August 1869, The board voted to appoint him chief engineer, entrusting him with the authority his father once held. The formal resolution cited his experience and his intimate knowledge of the plans. Washington accepted the role with a quiet resolve. He later wrote that he had determined at once to carry out his father's cherished plan. He moved quickly to steady the project, reassuring investors and city officials that construction would proceed without delay. Washington's command was not a mere inheritance. It was a deliberate continuation of expertise, discipline, and ambition. He reassembled the engineering team, reviewed every calculation, and began organizing the labor force. The bridge's momentum returned, anchored by a new leader who understood both the technical challenges ahead and the personal cost of failure. Washington's appointment ensured the Roebling vision would not die with its originator. Under his direction, preparations advanced toward the first great challenge, laying the foundations beneath the East River. To build a bridge across the East River, engineers needed to reach solid ground buried beneath layers of silt and water. The answer came in the form of giant wooden caissons, sealed pressurized chambers sunk to the riverbed. Each caisson was a massive box, its sides and roof made from thick timbers, its bottom left open. Workers entered through airlocks, stepping into an environment unlike anything most had ever known. Inside, compressed air forced water and mud away, creating a dry workspace deep below the river's surface. The Brooklyn caisson settled at 44.5 feet beneath high water, while the Manhattan side plunged even deeper, over 70 feet down, where the pressure more than doubled what men experienced at street level. Every shift inside the caisson meant hours in a world of constant noise and humidity, where the air felt thick and heavy. Lanterns burned dimly in the haze, illuminating teams of men wielding shovels and picks, scraping away mud and rock. As the earth was removed, the box itself slowly sank, guided by the weight of granite blocks stacked above. The deeper the descent, the greater the air pressure needed to keep the river at bay. At full depth, the pressure inside the Manhattan caisson reached nearly 35 pounds per square inch, almost 3 times atmospheric pressure. Each entry or exit required careful passage through an airlock, a small chamber where pressure could be raised or lowered in stages. The caisson method allowed the bridge's foundations to reach stable bedrock, anchoring the immense towers that would support the span. It was a feat of ingenuity, one that demanded both technical precision and human endurance. The method was new to American engineering on this scale, and its risks were not fully understood. Yet without these pressurized chambers, the Brooklyn Bridge could not have risen from the river. The caissons made the impossible possible, but inside their walls, the dangers multiplied with every foot gained. Inside the caissons, the air pressed in from all sides, thick and humid, making every breath feel heavier than the last. Men worked by lantern light, shoveling mud and stone in shifts that stretched for hours beneath the river. At first, the danger seemed obvious: falling timbers, sudden leaks, the ever-present risk of fire. But soon a new threat surfaced, one that no one could see or predict. Laborers began to complain of stabbing pains in their joints, especially after climbing up from the depths. Others staggered out of the airlocks only to collapse on the dock, their legs refusing to move, their arms numb and useless. Some never regained feeling, their bodies left twisted and weak. A few died within days, their symptoms a mystery to the doctors called to help. Superintendents recorded these cases in their daily logs: headaches, dizziness, crippling pain, and in the worst attacks, paralysis that crept from the limbs to the chest. The term caisson disease appeared in medical reports and newspaper columns, but no one agreed on a cause. Some physicians blamed the compressed air itself, while others suspected poison or overwork. Theories multiplied, but answers were scarce. There were no protocols for treatment, no guidelines for how long a man could safely work below before returning to normal air. Rest was the only remedy, and it rarely worked. The bridge's foundation, once seen as a marvel of modern engineering, now hid a growing hazard. Each descent into the caisson carried a risk that could not be measured or managed. For every man who emerged unscathed, Another suffered in silence, his pain misunderstood or dismissed. The invisible danger haunted the workforce, turning innovation into a source of dread. The project pressed on, but the cost, still uncounted, rose with every shift below the river. Washington Roebling believed that leadership meant sharing every danger with his men. Day after day, he entered the caissons himself, descending through the airlocks into the stifling chambers beneath the river. The pressure inside was immense, more than 3 times what he would feel above ground. Even experienced laborers dreaded the descent, but Washington insisted on being present for every major challenge, logging each shift in his battered notebook. He spent hours supervising as the teams chipped away at mud and stone, pushing the caissons deeper in search of bedrock. The air inside was thick and hot, the roar of machinery constant, the threat of disaster always close. In early 1872, after months of repeated exposure, Washington began to feel a peculiar numbness in his legs and back. He brushed it off as fatigue, unwilling to let the project slow. Then came a particularly long day in the Manhattan caisson, when delays forced him to stay below for far longer than any doctor would have advised. By the time he surfaced, his body was racked with pain and dizziness. Within hours, he collapsed, unable to move his limbs or catch his breath. Doctors struggled to explain what had happened. The term caisson disease was still new, and theories about its cause ranged from overwork to mysterious poisons in the air. What they could see was unmistakable. The chief engineer, once so vigorous, was now paralyzed and bedridden. Washington's willingness to face the same risks as his men had brought him to the brink. The bridge's most important mind was suddenly cut off from the worksite, his future uncertain, his sacrifice written into the very stones rising above the river. Washington Roebling spent his days confined to a second-floor room at 110 Columbia Heights, a few blocks from the bridge's rising towers. He could no longer visit the site or stand among the workers, but the project never left his sight. From his bed, he kept watch through a telescope, recording the slow progress of stone and cable as they crept skyward. Sheets of technical notes and letters piled up on his bedside table, each one filled with calculations, corrections, and instructions for the engineers below. Every week, messengers carried Washington's handwritten directives to the bridge office, while trusted assistants returned with updates and questions. The chief engineer's presence lingered in every detail, even as his body refused to heal. The irony was unmistakable. The same caissons that had anchored the bridge to bedrock had robbed Washington of his mobility. The man who once walked the length of the riverbed now measured progress from a distance, his world reduced to the view framed by his bedroom window. Yet his mind remained sharp, and his authority over the project was never in doubt. Engineers and contractors deferred to his expertise, knowing that every major decision still passed through his hands. Washington's private struggle shaped the daily reality of the bridge's construction. His absence on the worksite left a gap that could not be filled by any assistant or foreman. The bridge pressed forward, but the task of translating his vision into action would soon fall to someone else in the Roebling household. Emily Roebling stepped into a world few women of her era were allowed to enter. With Washington confined to his bed, she became the vital link between the chief engineer and the sprawling construction site. Each morning, Emily gathered notes, diagrams, and technical instructions from her husband's bedside, absorbing the language of mathematics, materials science, and cable engineering. Letters from the period show her handwriting filling the margins, calculations checked, questions answered, revisions drafted for the men waiting at the towers. Board meeting records from the 1870s list her attendance among engineers and trustees, a rare sight in any public project of the time. She did not simply relay messages, she argued specifications, negotiated with suppliers, and defended Washington's decisions before skeptical officials. Her mastery of the technical details became clear in moments of crisis, when she exposed fraudulent steel wire shipments and insisted on proper standards. Contractors and foremen came to trust her judgment, knowing she spoke with the authority of the Roebling name and her own growing expertise. For over a decade, Emily managed the daily operations that kept the bridge advancing. She was present for every milestone, from the spinning of the first cable to the final stone set in place. On opening day in May 1883, Emily crossed the completed span before anyone else, riding in a carriage and carrying a rooster as a symbol of triumph. Her journey was more than ceremonial. It was the culmination of years spent translating vision into reality, proving that leadership could come from unexpected places, and that in the shadow of tragedy, new strength could rise. The Brooklyn Bridge stands as a monument to vision, but its stones are set in sacrifice. Over 14 years of construction, the work claimed at least 20 lives, some lost to the silent agony of caisson disease, others to falls, explosions, or accidents high above the river. Names like John Myers and Patrick McGovern flickered briefly in the city's newspapers, their deaths recorded in a few lines before fading into the background of progress. Many more left the site permanently disabled, their families left to struggle without support. Coroner reports described bodies marked by paralysis and pain, symptoms that remained a medical mystery for years. The bridge's foundations, dug by men who braved the dark and the pressure, became a quiet graveyard beneath the East River. Yet on May 24, 1883, the city turned out in celebration. Flags lined the approaches, and crowds surged onto the new span, eager to cross from Brooklyn to Manhattan on foot. President Chester Arthur and Mayor Franklin Edson led the procession, followed by a parade of dignitaries, marching bands, and veterans. Emily Warren Roebling, who had carried the project through its darkest hours, was the first to ride across carrying a rooster as a symbol of victory. In that moment, the bridge was more than an engineering feat. It was a promise fulfilled, a link between worlds. But beneath the music and the speeches, the cost lingered, written in the obituaries and the empty places at dinner tables across the city. The Brooklyn Bridge endures as more than stone and steel. It is a ledger of sacrifice, written in suffering and resolve. Today, engineers still face risks that demand vigilance and humility. Every landmark we cross stands on lessons paid in lives and hardship. We inherit their ambition, but also their warning. Progress demands a human toll we must never ignore. What do you think we owe those who build our world?